Right. Let's back up. I want to mention one thing that we were touching on. Service animals aren't pets. All right. So the joke I had, you can't, if it's a seeing eye dog, that's a service animal, not a pet. And yes, they now have those emotional pets, and people take them on airplanes and into restaurants and stuff like that. That's all we'll say about that. I don't know. Yeah, there's a website somewhere on the internet that actually tells you how to get your dog registered as an emotional pet. They give you the forms and all of that so that, yeah, you could do it. If it's an emotional one, how do you do it? I got an alligator that's an emotional. Makes me feel better. Service animals do, but now they've got medical devices, like she said, that this cat was not trained. And if you've ever tried to train a cat, you know that ain't going to work. But it said it calmed her anxiety issues, and she had a doctor's letter. Therefore, it became a medical device, not a pet. And you can't violate that because now she'd be protected and say, hey, can't do that. I know a guy that got sued, and I don't know, at this point it starts, like you said, starts getting stupid. He owned an 11-story building in Nashville, Tennessee. He had a guy in a wheelchair come in, and he showed the guy in the wheelchair the first floor unit and did not show him the unit on the 11th floor, and the man in the wheelchair said that's a violation. He had an elevator, but literally, I don't know, this may sound bad, literally the guy in the wheelchair could not reach the 11th floor button. I mean, it was way up here. And sitting in a wheelchair, he couldn't reach it. And Jim thought he was helping the guy by saying, hey, I'll show you the one that's available down here, but you can't reach. Literally, physically can't reach that. But yet he still got fined as a violation for not showing all of the available properties and only showed the one that the guy in the wheelchair. So
our hotels in Phoenix, we have lifts for all the pools, chair lifts.
Yeah.
Never been used ever, 11 years. No one's ever gotten to it. But we have this lady who's going around to different hotels and saying, well, I can't get into the hot tub because you don't have a hot tub lift.
Yeah, got to have a lift. Yep. The lift into the pool's broke, and they didn't know it for 6 years.
My boyfriend's father needs it, and they actually settled out of court because it kept breaking down on them. So they go to one downtown.
So they go to the one down. Why didn't they just fix this one? Cheaper to pay the lawsuit?
That's what I said. I was like, I would make them fix it.
You guys know that the Ford knew that the Pinto was designed wrong, but they did the math and figured it was cheaper to pay off people than it was to recall all the Pintos and fix them. That's a true story. You can Google that. They figured lawsuits were cheaper than recalling all of the Pintos and fixing them. All right. Destruction of the premises. Destruction of the premises happens, maybe there's a fire or a flood or something where part of the property gets destroyed. You can, or often is the case, that rent gets prorated down. We had a house in Anderson that had a detached garage. It flooded, and all of the base where it touched the ground kind of rotted away, and eventually the structure started becoming unsafe, so we took it down and left the pad for the guy to park on. And he literally came to us and said, hey, I rented this with a detached garage. Now I don't have that coverage. I think my rent should be reduced. And he's absolutely correct. So we reduced his rent and then didn't renew to him. No. That's wrong. We did. He was actually a really good tenant. And I was joking with him when I said that. I said, okay, well, we'll reduce your rent like $100, and we agreed $100 was the value. I said, but when it comes time to renew, don't expect us to renew for you troublemaker tenants. He actually lived there like 7 years. 6 years. So destruction, often you can change the price, all right, based on either square footage or the number of rooms and whatever you guys can agree on. If you lose basement floods, you lose so much, or if one of the bedrooms, now it's just a 2-bedroom that's available, you can prorate it or do it based on usage. Now, the last 2 things I want to talk about in this lease provision are going to sound kind of familiar. The first one is called subletting. Subletting. When a landlord rents to a tenant 1, and then tenant 1 rents a portion of the property to tenant 2. Very common in the commercial world. Tenant 1 may buy 10,000 square feet because they're a manufacturer. Then all of a sudden something happens to their business. They don't need 10,000 square feet, so they use 8,000, and they get a subtenant that's going to use the other 2,000 square feet for something else. All right? That would be a sublease. That's a tenant of a tenant. In the grand scheme of don't do that, this is the number one thing. All right? Because here's the problem. If tenant 2 doesn't pay their portion of the rent, who's on the hook? Tenant 1, because there is no contract between the landlord and tenant 2. Landlord cannot go to court and sue tenant 2 because the first thing the judge is going to say is, where is his contractual obligation with you? Well, it's really not with me. Then you can't sue him. You would have to sue tenant 1, and tenant 1 would have to sue tenant 2. All right? In my residential contract, I specifically forbid subleasing without my approval. Because typically in the residential world, tenant 1 is not subleasing a portion of the house, they're leasing the entire house because they can't afford any more and they leave. Well, I don't want that because I don't have that obligation to tenant 2, so I can't sue them. The next thing, one step up, and you've heard this before, is called the Assignment of Elise. Tenant 2 can actually be assigned tenant 1's rights and obligations. Now if tenant 2 fails to pay, there is a contractual obligation between the landlord and the tenant with this assignment being added on, right? So that's called the Assignment of Elise. There may be some very good times for you guys to assign a lease if you think about it. If you've got a tenant that's paying above market rate, you don't really want to kick him out and get a new tenant because the new tenant may actually pay less than what you're at. So you may want the new guy to assign to the first guy so that you're getting the above market rate. Conversely, that could also happen with below market, so sometimes you don't want to do it. You also may want to record a lease. It's in the book. A couple things in the book that don't seem to be on the slides. On page 334, they talk about recording a lease. In Indiana, a lease longer than 3 years has to be recorded anyway. All right? Now, that means a lease longer than 3 years, not a 1-year lease that is renewed over and over and over and over. If you sign a 5-year lease, should be recorded. And that is to make sure that both parties, finger quote, remember their obligations if they go to court. You can always pull that lease out in front of a judge and go, here's the one that got recorded. I'm not sure where his lease came from, but here's the real lease. All right, it's been signed and notarized and put into the recording. Plus, if you're a landlord, that lease has value, right? If you've got a tenant And let's go commercial. If you've got a tenant paying $1,000 a month on a 10-year lease, that's $120,000 value that you may want to use as collateral for something else. I want to buy a new truck. You got any money? No, but I got this asset that's worth $120,000. So you would record it. So there are some good reasons to record it. Now this last thing there on page 334, well, second to last thing, is a thing called a non-disturbance clause. Non-disturbance clause. Let me start this by saying, very important for you to know, this is not in any residential mortgage I have ever seen. All right? This has to be in the mortgage as well. So I did not misspeak there. Because what a non-disturbance clause is this. It happens in the commercial investment world where the landlord is in trouble with the bank, but the tenant is not. And the tenant is paying the rent like they're supposed to, but the landlord is the one that's doing the screw up. And what happens when the landlord defaults on his mortgage? It gets called due, right? Back to the acceleration clause. There's this clause called a non-disturbance clause inside of the lease where the tenant says, whoa, 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 wait a minute. I have got a lot of money and value in this building, and because he has messed up, I will start paying my lease directly to you, Mr. Bank, and don't evict me while you're messing with him in foreclosure court. Everybody get what I'm saying? In the residential world, when the bank forecloses, they want to kick everybody out and do all that. In the commercial world, the tenant can step up and go, I want to exercise my non-disturbance clause, which says I will now continue to make my rent, but I'll pay it directly to the bank, so you can't evict me because I've got advertising, I've been here 10 years, we've got a lot of marketing going on, I can't just move. For example, the marsh that was down here on Smith Valley, when the owner went into foreclosure, Marsh said, I can't move tomorrow. We just can't move. But we've got a lot of advertisement in the newspaper and everybody knows. So we're going to exercise our non-disturbance clause while we put the process in motion to maybe build a new building, which is what they did, and moved. All right? Miguel, you had a question?
I do. Does this non-disturbance clause have to be signed at the beginning of the lease, or is that something you can exercise?
No, the non-disturbance clause is usually a clause that's in the lease already. All right? It's a clause. Now, this is in the lease, and I'm talking like publicly traded, big-time commercial leases. It's not going to be in the lease that you got to buy a single-family home and rent out. This is for the big heavy hitter guys, publicly traded commercial companies that can't just move on a dime. All right?
You're saying you've never seen it in residential because even if they claim that, the bank just doesn't care.
Yeah, it's not in the residential world because the bank doesn't care. You know, they want their money back. And understand why, we're running long on this, but let's go back and understand why. Where is the value of a house, residential, generated from? Think back to the appraisal chapter. Where is the value of a house, residential, come from? It comes from, how is it determined? I'm trying to get you guys to say something. If I have a residential house and I hire an appraiser to tell me my value, where does my value literally come from? Yeah, the appraiser, but what is he? He's getting it from other properties that have sold in the neighborhood, right? Comps. If I have an income property, where's the value coming from? The lease that's in place, right? So if a bank is foreclosing upon an owner that has a big heavy hitter commercial in there and they throw that tenant out, what does it do to the value of that asset that they're taking back? It goes down because there's now no income. So literally, banks would like and often want this non-disturbance clause because they want that tenant in place so that when they sell the house, sell the property on foreclosure, it has value, more value. Matter of fact, there was a mall in Dayton, Ohio, where the bank literally moved a manager into the mall to collect rent because they were going to sell the mall. It has more value with it full than empty. So they didn't really want to kick out the tenants. But in the residential world, notice one of the things we didn't comp on was vacant or occupied. So my house gets its value from your house sale, Josh's house sale, and Matthew's house sale. Nowhere did we say, was my house vacant? Does that make a difference? No. So the residential world, they want everybody out. Nice, clean foreclosure. In the commercial world, value comes from the lease that's actually in place. They want to keep them there. And they do that by exercising this non-disturbance clause. Cool. Let's move on.